Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. Does it feel like a dollar isn't worth a dollar anymore? At first, inflation feels good for some of us. Homeowners see their houses rapidly increase in nominal price, the stock market appears to rise, even used cars and trucks sitting in the driveway growing older somehow appear to become more valuable. But when you fill up your cart at the grocery store, pay for skyrocketing insurance and tax bills, and account for rapid and permanent increases in housing, energy, and all the other costs of living, you start to feel the sting of runaway inflation. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Federal Reserve, in the past 3 years, groceries are up 20% across the board, gas is up 45%, energy is up 38%, and credit card debt is up 45%. This would all be well and good if our salaries doubled overnight. Has yours? Debasement of our currency has eroded our standard of living, degraded nutrients in our food supply, and left us poorer and sicker than any time in recent history. Fiat inflation is a hidden tax lobbied without your consent, eroding the spending power of every dollar you've ever earned. In a debt-based fiat system, saving is a losing strategy. Increasingly, we're incentivized to spend immediately, not save. Corporations are incentivized to borrow, not earn. With cheaper access to massive low-interest debt, the ruling class is able to gleefully strip mine any remaining wealth from the middle and lower classes. Since 1900, our dollar has lost nearly 99% of its spending power. This is not an accident. In 1900, a single dollar could buy a pair of patent leather shoes, a woman's house dress, or even be saved with confidence. The average American could afford to eat 175 pounds of meat a year, mostly beef, as well as plenty of eggs, bacon, and sausage. Collectively, our heart health was also far better. By 1972, we ate 104 pounds of red meat a year, and as of 2019, our consumption was cut in half to just 56 pounds. Since then, obesity and disease has become widespread in adults and children alike as our quality of life has deteriorated. Using propaganda from fraudulent studies, monetary distortions, and backward subsidies, the collusion of government, industry, and special interests has intentionally shifted diets away from healthful whole foods and nutrient-dense meats to industrial seed oils, GMO grains, and fake meats. Doritos, Lucky Charms, and plant-based fake meats don't increase in price nearly as quickly as real food like beef and veggies. For corporations, selling highly processed industrial products is much more profitable than selling meat. As our guest this week quips, you can print Doritos like you can print fiat dollars. Real food, though, has become cost prohibitive for many of us, so we eat processed industrial junk instead. This hurts people, especially kids. Thanks to government manipulation of food prices and top-down dietary recommendations, our mass consumption of ultra-processed foods understates the rate of inflation in our food system and makes us sicker, allowing big food and big pharma to profit on both sides. As it turns out, feeding people poison and managing their sickness is big business. But this story goes far deeper than just big food and big pharma. Unchecked inflation has not only undermined real purchasing power and destroyed our health, but the fiat dollar has also enabled endless war profiteering without the consent of the people. The most powerful weapon ever conceived by man is the fiat money printer. Today, we're here with Matthew Lysiak, a nationally recognized investigative journalist, crime reporter, and award-winning author of the brilliant new book, Fiat Food, which unravels the shocking history of how inflation destroyed our health, our food system, and our quality of life. In this episode, you'll discover how a 100-year conspiracy and propaganda campaign by anti-meat religious groups, the medical industrial complex, and politicians hijacked our food system for profit, why observational studies on diet and health are misleading and are often weaponized for political and financial gain, how mainstream media and religious groups manipulate nutritional science to control public health, why the government masks the true cost of inflation resulting from severing ties to the gold standard, why the public school system deprives kids of proper nutrition, and much more. Let's go hang out with Matthew. Hey folks, welcome back. We're here with Matthew Lysiak, a nationally recognized journalist and award-winning author whose fascinating new book, Fiat Food, unravels the shocking debacle of how inflation destroyed our health and our food system. As an investigative journalist for the New York Daily News, Matthew has reported on hundreds of national stories and has appeared as a contributor on The Today Show, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, and countless other national and local media outlets to discuss his work. Matthew is also co-author of the best-selling series Hildy Cracks the Case, which was inspired by actual news stories his 9-year-old daughter and crime reporter Hildy wrote in real life. And the story of his family is also the subject of a series, Home Before Dark, on Apple TV. Thanks so much for joining us today, Matthew.
Thanks for having me, Abel. It's great to see you again, too.
Likewise, yeah. And as I understand, you were once in the good graces of the media as a mainstream, acceptable journalist, but something kind of happened along the way. What happened?
Yeah, I've fallen heretic. Um, I was a crime reporter for 15 years. I worked at the New York Daily News, which at the time was the fifth biggest paper in the country. I was the reporter who swooped in nationally on any breaking news story. And I was adored by the mainstream press. I've appeared on, as you mentioned, every major TV outlet, and I've uh, contributed to the New York Times, the Guardian as well. So yeah, I've been around the journalistic square, as they would say. But this most recent book is something that the mainstream journalism community does not want to touch, and which is why I'm like very grateful for you to have me on the podcast and get to share this story.
Yeah, I'm psyched. And as we were talking before we started recording here, I mean, this book, Fiat Food, is touching upon different worlds that need to come together for people to understand exactly what's going on here. Because, as I've mentioned, on this show, we've really talked about how unhealthy these vegetable oils and newfangled foods and additives and all this other stuff have been for us over the years, and how it really results in a lot of problems for our health, physically, mentally, even the health of our souls. But what we haven't touched upon so much, that's coming to light now, and I'm glad people are starting to pay attention to it, is how inflation relates to all of this, and how, if you even turn back the clock and look back a little further in time, that's a gnarly story where it seems like there's a lot going on from the top down that's somewhat orchestrated over time to lead us to exactly where we are. So maybe you can start by explaining why this story was attractive to you to start to investigate, coming from the world of crime.
Yeah, even before I was a crime reporter, I was a fat little kid growing up in the '90s under the dietary food pyramid, which any of your audience who grew up in the '90s remembers. It was a poster hanging up on any pizza shop or sandwich shop, and it was our government informing us that the best and the brightest health minds telling us that we needed to have 6 to 11 helpings of grains a day and to limit saturated fat. Um, I gained weight. My parents followed this advice. I went to the public schools where it was law that the food had to abide by these guidelines. And at the age of 16, I got cancer. It was pretty bad cancer. It was not that there's a good kind of cancer. Mine was called osteogenic sarcoma in my leg. And I was out for about a year and a half getting treatment. And I remember at one point asking the doctor, I said, "Well, what did I do to get this? How did I get this?" And he said, "Well, we don't really know what causes cancer. It could be genetic, it could be other things." But intuitively, I knew that I was doing something wrong. I was ingesting large amounts of sugar, large amounts of grains, and at that time in the '90s, seed oils had become prevalent as you know, everywhere. So I had a large amount of seed oils too. And looking back, I think it would have been more shocking if my body responded positively to these things. So I had cancer for about a year and a half. So when I emerged as a crime reporter, at the New York Daily News, I never like I always had health in the back of my mind. I was always still because I'm in remission for cancer. So when something like that kind of happens to you, you it never really leaves you. And what I had done and how to prevent getting sick and my health has always been something I was very important to me. So it kind of I was always on a parallel journey. So yeah, I was a crime reporter and that was my main gig. I was I was the national reporter, so it was really a job I always wanted. I swooped in around the country at a moment's notice anytime breaking news broke, and my job was to find motive. In particular, with mass shootings, I wrote a book for Simon and Schuster called "Newtown: An American Tragedy." I worked with HarperCollins on a book too, and Scholastic, as you mentioned. But when I found this theory posited by Seyfuddin Amous, I don't know if your audience will know who he is. Really amazing mind, and I would argue he's one of the top economic minds alive today. And he wrote the Bitcoin Standard, but it was a book he wrote called the Fiat Standard, which really stoked my curiosity because I was reading this during COVID when I was re-examining a lot of axioms I'd accepted. And there was a chapter in it, chapter 8, called Fiat Food. And on its face, it seemed ridiculous. It was this idea that there is this huge conspiracy between all these shady characters to manipulate our food supply. And as much as I respected Saif as an economic mind, I understood he wasn't an investigative reporter or a nutritionist. It's just like, what is this? Um, and I began fact checking this chapter. And to my shock, like Saif had understated this case, if anything. He and when I began digging into Fiat Food, the book that I wrote recently, I was blown away by the amount of corruption that had occurred in our food supply. And it wasn't, and I was telling you off camera how one of the things that really shocked me was that in a lot of my work, I really have to dig hard to find the motive, find the source, find where the corruption is, get to the core of it. This is all right on the surface for anybody to see. A lot of these major players aren't even pretending. They're not even really covering their tracks. It's all right there. And in Fiat Food, I have a little over 200 citations. I know this is a very, it's a hard case to swallow. So I'm pretty meticulous on tracking all this information. And yeah, one of the things that I think your audience really should know is that we have a lot of conversations about health and wellness and changes in the American diet, but it's almost like a lot of these conversations they act as though it's a storm that comes in, this weather event that nobody really has control over. It's just kind of something that look at this, look at how this all happened. No, this was all intentional, completely intentional by leaders who did this knowing full well what they were doing.
So, what exactly did they do?
um, beginning in beginning in August, I would track this back to August 15th, 1971, when Richard Nixon decoupled from gold. And this is a pivotal date for me in this book because before that, we had these three major players at work. We had nutrition science, which was already being corrupted by industry to come up with the results that were industry friendly. We had a religious group, the Seventh day Adventists, who had a firm conviction that eating meat led to carnal desires, which essentially led to every health malady under the sun. So if you were alive in 1910, you believed that masturbation caused cancer, caused respiratory illness, caused everything. And there was a connection believed that red meat caused these carnal desires, which science would later validate. Um, so the idea behind the church was that the apocalypse was coming. The Seventh Day Adventists were an offshoot of the Millerites, the Miller movement of the 1800s, which um, made problematic made the problematic statement of an exact date of when the end of times were coming, which cult leaders should never do, right? Like, you don't give the exact date. You're vague, like Al Gore. You say 20 years, 30 years from now. You don't give dates. The guy gave a date, and when the apocalypse didn't come, it became known, ironically, as the Great Disappointment. But at the time, thousands of people were waiting outside for this apocalypse. One of the uh, one of the parishioners of the Millerite movement was somebody called Ellen White, who, as a young girl, would go and listen to these fire and brimstone teachings from the Millerites. And after the Great Disappointment, Ellen was walking home one day from school and she got hit in the head by a rock. And she went into a coma. When Ellen woke up from this coma, she claimed to have visions from God. And God said, Ellen, the apocalypse actually is still coming. And what you need to do is prepare mankind to be clear of body and soul. And the way to do this is to repress the human sex drive, which is causing all these impurities. At the time, in the 1900s, basically any time before 1970, people ate meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if they could afford it. And she became obsessed. She was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist movement. So she founded this movement, and part of it was this obsession with replacing meat with grains, not for profit of the wealth of the church, but because she really firmly believed that this would purify mankind. And I tracked this in my book. She met a young man named John Harvey Kellogg, and she tasked him with finding a food to replace meat for breakfast. And he, in those efforts, discovered Kellogg's cornflakes. John Harvey Kellogg was, it's kind of hard to overstate his influence on diet in the early 1900s. He was a celebrity doctor of the time. So he was around the country giving speeches. His writings are pretty prolific. And he was a real masochist. He advocated pouring carbolic acid on the clitorises of young women to prevent them from masturbating, chaining men, young boys, and performing anesthesia without surgery. When that wasn't effective, he was hoping cornflakes would do the job of repressing the human sex drive. And the church went into overdrive, not just promoting cornflakes, but all these other grain-based foods and putting out anti-meat literature. John Harvey Kellogg later discovered that Ellen White, the church's founder, had been eating meat all along. I found letters from about Ellen from the chef of the church, who was like, this is really bothering me. Ellen's eating fried chicken all the time. So John Harvey Kellogg ended up leaving the church and staying in the same field, though. He became a eugenicist and led a movement in Michigan that convinced the legislature to sterilize over 3,100 women in the state of Michigan who he found to be genetically predisposed or, to whatever he at the time thought was not ideal. But after John Harvey Kellogg left the church, his protege was somebody named Leanna Cooper, who founded the American Dietetic Association, which in time became the government nutrition policy for the entire country. I bring all of this up because in the context to 1971 and Nixon's decoupling, because despite the church's influence and the corporate influence over these nutritional studies, pre-1971, the American public was still eating meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And what happened in 1971 was when Nixon decoupled from gold, and Nixon isn't the only villain here. Nixon is one of the villains, but he was forced to, in many ways, decouple from gold because America had been perpetuating a fraud for many years. So previous to 1971, while Americans themselves could not redeem their dollars for gold, foreign banks could. So it put a powerful restraint on the ability for the Federal Reserve to keep printing dollars. But the problem is Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in particular increased spending so much, it exceeded the amount of gold that we had to redeem these dollar notes, which at the time were $35 per ounce of gold. We didn't have it. So we were perpetuating this fraud. So under Nixon, all it would have taken were a few central banks to come at the same time to redeem their promissory notes for gold to expose the American Federal Reserve for what it was, which was just a complete fraud. Now, Nixon was heading into re-election. He gave this speech that shocked. It became known as a Nixon shock, where he said the dollar is no longer redeemable for gold, and what was going to happen, and everyone knew it, was that the amount of dollars were going to increase. This would provide a short-term boost for Nixon politically, because for a bit it would seem like the economy would pick up. But of course, as we all know, you can't escape cause and effect. And there was going to be a significant increase in dollars chasing the same amount, approximately the same amount of goods, causing prices to rise. Now, Nixon had agriculture. He appointed somebody to head his agriculture department named Earl Butz, who spoke about the importance of food and the rising price of food, and how a housewife will buy a sofa maybe once every 10 years, he told a reporter. So she doesn't really notice a change in prices. But she goes to the supermarket every week. So they needed to do everything in their power to keep the price of food low. And this isn't a small detail, because governments have always been very acutely aware of the connection between political instability, the ability to retain power, and the rising cost of food. They're linked like this. In 2022 alone, there were 12,500 food-related riots, according to American University. In Sri Lanka that same year, in July, the price of food rose so high that July, the hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankans raided the palace, and the leaders had to flee. So they've always understood this, but instead of, coming clean and saying, look, food prices are going to go up, what they did, and I document this in Fiat Food extensively, is the government began going on what essentially became a 50 to 60 year gaslighting campaign to restructure the American food system to make it seem like we are living in an abundance of food, while in reality, the very nutrients that we need to thrive have become cost prohibitive. So they began doing this right away, right after 1971 and during 1971, with direct subsidies to corn, soy, and sugar lobbies. So billions of dollars began churning from this fiat money printer into these different industries, and you begin seeing the incentive shift. Meanwhile, the church, which up until then was kind of okay popularity-wise, it was still sort of looked at as like this weird little church, but they were growing. But it became the recipient of millions and millions of dollars in government subsidies, many of which were channeled into a university called Loma Linda in California, who would churn out these studies that began appearing in the 1970s to today, which always validate their religious conviction that meat is bad for you. In particular, red meat causes X health ailment, and grains are healthy. I promise that 90% of the studies your audience reads to this day are these studies from Loma University, which is the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which validate their religious convictions. And I don't want to get too in the weeds on these studies, but these are observational studies. So if I were to tell you, for an example, I talked to 100 cancer patients, and 94% of them at some point have drinking milk. This would lead to a study observationally that headline, milk linked to cancer. And it would all be factual, it'd be true, but it's misleading. Real science, and what I did was I talked to a lot of epidemiologists and data-driven scientists who explained that these studies that are run by the church that come out, they're not geared towards other scientists, they're geared towards the media. because it's not really science, it's these press releases. Real science is done in clinical randomized studies. That's where you can control variables and establish causal relations. Observational studies can only establish association, which is like, kind of useless. But the fiat money printer weaponized these studies, where beforehand in the 1970s, these studies kind of existed, but they were more corporate pushed, because for corporations, pushing a plant-based toxic diet is far more profitable than pushing a meat-based diet. So their incentive is built in. For the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the anti-meat crusade is a religious conviction. And for the government, when they swooped in the all-powerful money printer, where they're actually able to weaponize the entire productive labor of not just America, but really the entire world post-Bretton Woods, you have the tool of obfuscating the consequences of money printing for these officials to retain power. And it's a perfect storm of shit, which has resulted in any human being going into Walmart today and looking in line and seeing the degradation of the human body.
So I'm just going to share one of the quotes from your book. It's awfully convenient and curious that dietary recommendations financed by fiat inflation conclude that you should eat the foods that understate the extent of fiat inflation. And throughout the book, you kind of offer, without explanation, the price of a Big Mac went from 65 cents in the 70s or whatever to $4.95 and I'm making the numbers up, but you have so many examples of this throughout the book, as well as I think this is kind of a powerful example that might illustrate to people what happens when our dollar is inflated over time. In $1 in 1900 could buy a pair of leather shoes, a woman's house dress, or actually be saved with the assumption that your money would be there years later, maybe even worth more than it was when you put it in the bank. That absolutely is not the case now.
Yeah, it's stunning when you think about a child taking a $10 gold coin in 1904, burying it in the ground in a tin can, digging it up 10 years later. You could fully expect that $10 gold coin would have increased in purchasing power, would be able to buy more because of the technological advances that happen in between, the streamlining of productivity, the Model T conveyor belt, right? Today, if you take a $100 bill and you bury it in the ground, dig it up 10 years later, that $10 bill is going to be completely diminished. And my evidence is just take any 10-year period since 1970 or since the Federal Reserve, but especially since 1970, we're losing the purchasing power. And Seyfedina Moose, the author and economist, did a lot in helping me understand the impact that has not just on productivity, but just on your mindset. Because what it does is it turns around your grandmother's advice of thrift and saving. You save for the future. No. The wealthiest people in America today are those most in debt. And that's become the smart play because we live in a bizarro world where your savings is actually being diminished, but debt, which is how money's now created, we live in a debt currency, is thrift. It's harmful on so many levels. My book makes the case that most consequentially, it's you see it manifest in the human body, where when we were younger, in the early 1900s, an obese person was looked at as a sign of affluence. But today it's a sign of poverty, not of physical wealth, but of the physical body.
Yeah, and the incentives also were flipped, right? Whereas in the past, you could work and save and build a life for yourself and hopefully, pass that down to your children or your family or your community. And these days, now that we're all kind of noticing and feeling the pain of inflation in many aspects of our life, not just food, but kind of everywhere, it incentivizes spending everything you make right away because it's going to be worth less in the future. Borrowing as much as you can as a business strategy because it's the price of that debt is going to be less than the insane inflation that we're looking at just a few years coming up. And so that incentivizes the richest, wealthiest class of people to borrow as much as possible, and they have access to even cheaper debt than regular people do, such that the divide between rich and poor, and especially the middle class, is just pulled farther and farther away until the middle class collapses, which is something that we're kind of experiencing right now and directly relates to our health as well.
Yeah, this is something that's very difficult for people to understand too. I have a good friend, and he's a very moral man, and I'm trying to explain to him why not to pay off his house. He has a 3.2% interest rate, and I'm trying to explain, but because he has a moral base, men for centuries have believed debt is bad because it is. Except when our entire currency's been perverted, suddenly debt is good. It's very difficult to wrap your mind around, and they've the whole system relies on our inability to really notice. That's another thing that I learned. It's our inability to actually. They rely on the confusion, not just in diet, but in finances. They rely on us to outsource. I remember taking an economics class in college. I didn't graduate from high school, and I dropped out to start journalism when I was a kid. And I took a few part-time college classes just because I was interested. And I remember taking an economics course and thinking, man, I'm just not smart enough to understand Keynesian economics. It doesn't make sense to me. Took me a few years to realize that those people are morons. Like, they're preaching just bullshit propaganda. And when you really understand what Keynesian economics is, it's silly big words meant to just serve as court gesturing for the central money printer, the Federal Reserve, and the money printer. And it doesn't make sense. And a natural mind can't grasp it because it's contradictory. Um, and it's just part of like this campaign that's been waged against people's faculties. And I bring up the Keynesian economics and those professors because there's been this movement, I think, to have individuals outsource their decision making to these credentialed experts. And these credentialed experts in economics and in diet have lied to us or have just been wrong. And either way, I think if anything, this book, I hope, really gets people to kind of trust themselves once again and their natural instincts, not just with money, but with food.
So maybe we can explain a little bit how the masking of inflation works. I've got a couple of examples here that I was referencing before. So there's no explanation for why bacon in 1970 was 95 cents a pound, and by 2002, $7.36 a pound. It's a lot more than that now. But when you measure the amount of money that's coming in the direct meat that it could buy, in 1969, a family could buy 18.15 pounds of sirloin. In 2022, based upon their income, it would be 11.91 pounds. So that takes a little bit of thinking about for a second to understand what's going on. But essentially, diet soda, cornflakes, and fake meats in the consumer price index, measures of inflation that are kind of official and used, those indices are manipulated by inserting some of these fake substitute foods for the real thing to make it seem like our food is still cheap when in fact, if you're buying the actual meat, it's skyrocketing to the moon. Is that about right?
No, you nailed it. And what shocks me is how much respect you have for your audience if you're going to read out that many statistics. Kind of awesome.
They're smart
Like, this is a
cookies.
cool audience. Um, yeah, what you find is that so 1972, it was a convergence of events. So the Seventh Day Adventist Church actually kind of had an unspoken agreement with the environmental movement. And there was a book that came out at the time called The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, who, if any man has proven in time to be just catastrophically false in every prediction, it is this man, who still is quoted in the mainstream media today, to my shock. Um, but Paul Ehrlich, there was a huge belief in the 1970s that there are too many people and we were running out of resources. So that was one of the justifications for why, in the beginning, why we needed to transition away from meat. But what you'll find is that while food is actually relatively cheap today, you could buy a box of cornflakes and have that all day and just eat that all day. But the basic nutrients, like you're mentioning, the meat, eggs, animal-based products, are increasingly becoming simply foods for the upper middle class. Um, and you saw the CEO of Kellogg's come on a few weeks ago on CNBC and say, you know what? I know inflation is really hard, but that's why we're really marketing now for breakfast for dinner, cereal for dinner. And they have no problem profiting off of this. And it's not like they're all kind of working in tandem, because that's the power of the fiat money printer. The distortions that it can create by weaponizing the productive labor of the world, essentially, when it points its high powered beam in any direction, whether it be funding nutrition science and sending grants to anybody who will publish global warming propaganda or anti-meat propaganda, or it all moves in the same direction. It weeds out everything else. So if you're looking for a grant to talk about why red meat is, which we've had for thousands of years, it's pretty. We've had it a long time. I mean, there's a lot of history there. Um, if you want to say anything about it that isn't negative, good luck getting the grant, and good luck getting that tenure position at university. So it's absolutely insane how the manipulation spans and is spread out over all these different industries. Just a quick one of the things I mentioned in my book, and I know you read it, I'll share it with your audience just to show how this collaboration works. One of the most stunning events and synchronicities took place in January of 2023, when the Tufts Food Compass, and I think about these people more than I like to admit, the Tufts Food Compass, because it's the number one nutrition advice in the country right now. It's this Tufts Food Compass. And these are people who spend their life, they were children at one point, and they spent their life just studying nutrition. So what do these idiots come up with? They come up with a list that puts Fruit Loops ahead of red meat, uh, apple flavored Honey Nut Cheerios ahead of eggs and dairy. I mean, it's dumb. It's transparently dumb, transparently propaganda. Um, Same month, January 2023, that this comes out and makes major headlines, and it has the White House defending Fruit Loops, like the leader of the Free Rows defending the merit of Fruit Loops. Same month, 60 Minutes has a piece about a new weight loss drug, and it had a stunning revelation by a doctor named Dr. Fatima Stanford, who's just a despicable piece of humanity, who was explaining that lifestyle actually has nothing to do with health outcomes. It's a genetic brain disease. And
Right.
obesity is the result of, it's not your fault, it's a genetic brain disease. There was another expert on the show who appeared on this 60-minute show echoing the same sentiments. And little discussed was that they were both advisors for Novo Nordisk and paid consultants who created Ozempic. The 60-minute show was also sponsored by Ozempic. So you have this piece of trash human being who, and I'm harsh on her because, I mean, I don't think there's anything more vile that you can do, few things more vile that you can do than to separate people from that very, one of the core essences that make us foundationally human, which is our ability to control our own health outcomes. And she's telling us to outsource it. And she's eloquent, a beautiful girl with the white jacket, spewing these lies. And she's telling people that you have no control over the most basic, fundamental aspect of your own essence, your ability to be healthy. She's saying, no, it's a medical issue and you need to come to this corporation. So that same month, Abel, that same month, the American Pediatric Association, for the first time in 12 years, lowered and changed their obesity recommendations to now state that children as young as 11 are now eligible for these weight loss shots. So I couldn't find in my research a smoking gun where they all gathered. But it was clearly a PR campaign, and the food companies were in on it. The government, which promoted these studies, were in on it. The American Pediatric Association was in on it. 60 Minutes was in on it. So what do they all have in common? Well, I couldn't find a smoky room. Here's something interesting. Tufts Food Compass, sponsored by PepsiCo, Dannon, several pharmaceutical companies, including Johnson & Johnson. The 60 Minutes episode, sponsored by same food companies, more so the pharmaceutical companies. American Pediatrics Association, sponsored by these same companies. A lot of this money emerged from federal government grants and created by a fiat money printer. So, I mean, I'd have to be a little naive, right, to think it's all just a coincidence. And it's transparently dumb. Of course, Fruit Loops aren't better than meat, and soy chocolate milk isn't better than whole milk. Like, this is idiotic. We're supposed to believe this. If anything happened in COVID that was a blessing, it was that so many people saw these authorities for what they are. Like, they do not have our best interests at heart. They look at the human population in America as a means to an end.
So this propaganda, I think this is a really important point as well, and you kind of just touched upon it. The low-fat propaganda, and I guess all of this propaganda over the decades, spawned a new generation of Americans who no longer believed that health was found in nature, but in industrial products, and basically listening to the authorities. And if we look back in time as well, we used to be eating roughly twice as much meat in the 70s. We've whittled that down from over 100 pounds to somewhere in the 50s, 56 pounds, I think you mentioned in the book. Yet, we're hearing with every year that goes by, with every week that goes by, more and more reasons, some of them a little wild, that we shouldn't be eating meat because it's destroying the world, because it's bad for us, because politically and morally it's wrong. So all of these reasons to not eat this meat and eat the fake meat instead, or eat the bugs, like there are all these reasons all of a sudden to eat those things instead that don't really align with reality, it seems.
Oh, it's idiotic. And you can follow. Luckily, we're not completely Orwellian yet, where the media, you could still go into the New York Times time machine, it's called, and go see what they were saying. And in the early 1900s, it was don't eat meat. Meat causes carnal desires, which cause all disease. In the 1940s, that's shifted to don't eat meat because the troops need the meat, because they need to be strong to fight the Nazis. Plant victory gardens. We can't have the meat. Don't eat the meat. In the 1970s, it shifted to don't eat meat. Meat is too resource intensive, and we're running out of food because the population's exploding. It's overpopulation. Don't eat meat. Eat grains. That shifted again. Don't eat meat. It's heating it. I mean, the dumbest one of all is like the don't eat meat. It's changing the temperature of the earth. The first, it's making it too warm. And then when that proved to be demonstrably false, it's causing hurricanes. Don't cause a hurricane by eating too much meat. It's shifting. So you can predict what it'll be next. I have no idea, but it will always use your own guilt. That's the tool that is used against you. In the same way that the COVID shot and the masks were marketed as, you wear the mask to protect you and to protect me. Don't kill grandmother. This is don't eat meat because it's playing off of like the humans are so susceptible to guilt. Like I am too. We all are. And that's what they tap into. But it really hasn't changed. I mean, in the 1600s, it was like the idea that human behavior affects the weather. In the 1600s, they used to burn eccentric women when the crops weren't getting. So it's kind of the same playbook, just a little bit more sophisticated, but always the same. It just changes names and faces.
And you mentioned as well the environmental social governance score, which is essentially measuring a company's compliance with authority. And we see a lot of this kind of measuring that compliance, whether it's on a personal basis or companies. Maybe you can explain to people out there where some of these wacky policies are coming from the top down anyway.
They're coming from everywhere. I mean, it's like and that's another thing. Like we need to be vigilant because it's only going to get worse. I still work as a journalist. And I've been covering, for instance, the raw milk movement and how it's crazy. I mean, the ag companies, the Department of Agriculture, United States, is paid for by large agro businesses. Not a conspiracy. Go on their website, look at their corporate partnerships. It's and somehow all their policies seem to be to embolden their corporate sponsors at the expense of the independent smaller farmers, it's in particular dairy farmers. And you'll notice that regulations increasingly are becoming weaponized as a tool to weed out competition as opposed to the safety of the consumer. And you see it right now. There's a bit of hysteria over bird flu and raw milk. It's being leveraged as like another reason to not be able to drink a healthy raw milk. Raw milk is not what corporate ag wants because it's time consuming. I mean, the thing is, you actually have to treat your cow with respect. If you're gonna sell raw milk, you can't just have your cow rolling around and eating its own feces. Your cow needs to be like loved and treated well, or the milk doesn't come out right. Doesn't work. But that doesn't fit the model that Earl Butt started in 1970 when we needed to consolidate farms. And his motto was go big or go home. His move to consolidate the small farming, and that was also done through a lot of incentives. But I don't feel like I'm really answering your question. You're asking where this comes from. It's incentivized by all these different groups. So it's not like there is no conspiracy where they're all getting together. It's just in their best interest because for corporations, it's higher profits. For the church, it validates a religious conviction and it obscures the price of inflation. But you see like somebody like Eric Adams, who pretends he's a vegan. He eats meat and he's admitted he's lied about that. And he also is one of those fake vegans. But it's often taken out on our school children and it's being pushed through these government agencies into our kids through the public schools and hospitals and our most vulnerable citizens. So today, if you're, a public school kid in New York City, especially in the lower income schools, you're not getting any protein. So you're going to go through 12 years of life. And it's not just lunch anymore. Public schools in New York are now serving snack, dinner, breakfast, dinner. And they have meatless Mondays and meatless Fridays. They're going to try to get meatless everything. You come out of school metabolically compromised already and addicted to all these additives. And you're already so far behind. And it's really a tragedy and it's sad. And instead of feeling shame that these leaders should feel, they're virtue signaling about it, which just shows you how fucked up the whole world and system is right now.
Maybe you can touch upon the parallels too, because it's not just the food supply that this is happening to. If you look, one of my just hobbies is looking at architecture that's a few hundred years old, or architecture in different parts of the world. You notice a fundamental difference in how buildings looked and were built when supposedly people were in horses and buggies and just kind of dragging their knuckles around in Dr. Quinn world, whatever. You look now at the way that buildings are constructed, the materials are far lower quality. And it's very similar to swapping cornflakes for meat, except in architecture. You see it also in artwork and other areas of our lives. So maybe you can explain a little more about the fiat system and also what it enables in terms of not having to go to the populace and get their permission to fight endless wars or actually tax them directly. You can siphon money out of their bank accounts without them having any control over the situation, while kind of lowering the quality of everything around them at the same time.
No, you just said it. And I mean, you got to have Safety on to like really go into, or have Tucker Carlson on. I've become friends with Tucker and he has these very interesting takes on how architecture in particular, and so to say how they've all been perverted. Like Tucker lives in all wood because he can afford it now, right? Like he won't sleep. He doesn't like sleeping in rooms that aren't fully wood, like real wood. He thinks it really helps him. I believe that. But so in the American fiat system, you don't own your dollar. Ownership of your dollar has been rendered nothing more than a slogan, obviously, because you have somebody off to the side, an unelected bureaucrat, who can just print as much money as they need, which renders your actual value of your dollar not within your control. And in under a gold standard, pre-fiat, war was rare. So between 1815 and the Napoleonic Wars of 1815 and World War I in 1914, when there was a gold standard imposed or used in the world like no other times, we were at a relative peace. And the reason was simple. Leaders don't want to spend their own money. Like, war is expensive. And when you have a gold standard or a metal standard, you either have to have the consent of the populace or you have to spend your own money. And you can't wage a war for any length of time under a gold standard or under a hard currency, because you would have to either raise taxes on the populace or sell war bonds. So you need their support, and they're not going to support a war for too long. So wars were very brief. Only with fiat did war become a prolonged state of existence. So in America, we've been at war since 1971, with the exception of 4 years, 1976, 1977, 1978, and 2000. Those were the only 4 years that we have not been at war since. And the reason is because now, because of fiat, we can weaponize the entire productive labor of the citizenry. So we're taking the labor of the third shift diner worker who is a single mom working at home. We're taking her dollar, and we're making that, by printing more dollars, we're making her dollar lose value. And we're taking parts of that value towards the war. And we could do this until, and this has happened historically, the entire wealth of a nation is gone. Now, how has America waged war for this long, though? Wouldn't we? No, because when Bretton Woods Agreement happened in 1944, we convinced all these other countries around the world to peg their currency not to gold, but to the dollar. So we've have the ability now to use the wealth of not just America, but the productive labor of the entire world to wage war, which is why we're able to do this, perpetuate war for such a long time. And it leads to a ridiculously fucked up situation where you have the Jews in Israel having a dome that we built and funded, stopping bombs from the Palestinians and the Arabs, which we paid for their missiles, launching from the dome. I mean, it's absurd. We're funding all sides of all wars, and the only people who profit is the military-industrial complex. I could write a whole book on that. I won't, because I think people get bored, because it's a pretty simple premise. But ending the distortion of fiat would make war cost prohibitive again. And that would be a beautiful thing, because, I mean, look at nobody's, the American people are the big losers here, and we're the ones funding it by opting into this fiat system. So my solution to diet is my same solution as to ending wars or making wars less common. It's fiat. Like, Bitcoin doesn't solve everything. What Bitcoin does is it ends the fiat distortion caused by the central money printer. And in doing that, it brings back nature and brings back a balance in terms of ending relentless propaganda campaigns promoting Lucky Charms. I feel silly saying it, like promoting, like that. Maybe we will realize that Fruit Loops aren't better than meat, right? Like ending war, ending all these distortions that were created to hide the cost of inflation, or that are used to weaponize as a tool to weaponize other people's productive labor to fight a war in Tunisia that nobody even knows we're waging right now.
Yeah. So, well, and also one element of this is they kind of get to profit from both sides, the feeding people toxic poison or industrial waste, and then the sicknesses that eventually causes, which is also directly monetized. And the price of healthcare and medical fees and all of that have also rocketed to the moon. But if you can take yourself out of that system, at least a little bit at a time, and start to work in this parallel reality where value has value again, or currency has value, money has value, then a lot of these manipulations, as you're saying, stop working. So for people who aren't, like, we have some Bitcoiners and people who are into those parallel systems listening, but I still believe that it's a minority right now. That is starting to change, but maybe you could explain a little bit more about like why Bitcoin does provide some potential solutions for what we're looking at.
Well, Bitcoin would provide solutions for many things in terms of allowing people, it will change the psychology, because when you bury that Bitcoin for 10 years and you dig it back up 10 years later, just due to the fact that humans progress. So like things become more streamlined, technological advancements. You'll have more in your purchasing power, and that changes your psychology. It changes your view of your children. It changes your entire view of life. But I find in my research that the main, and I know there's a lot more, and I'm not an expert in Bitcoin. I mean, I think you know far more about Bitcoin than I do. But one thing that I know it does do is it destroys the fiat money printer. They can't coexist, and they can for a little bit. But when people see what Bitcoin is and truly understand it, and that's increasing over time, um, every time you use a little bit of Bitcoin and you take your fiat and transition it into Bitcoin, you take a dagger and you take a jab into the Federal Reserve, you take a jab into the fiat money printer, and you remove the incentive to distort these things. So if there is no fiat money printer, there is no incentive to distort the food supply. It doesn't exist. Why try to hide the monetary inflation that just went poof? We don't have to. I always feel ridiculous. We don't have to pretend like Fruit Loops are healthier than meat. Like, we can admit the truth. We don't have to have these global warming scams and make it seem like we're always in the middle of a crisis. And we don't need to. We can save the consumer price index from, which is just a statistical tautology. It's like a press release, anything that is it's based on the dollar. So people make spending decisions based on a rising dollar. So they make choices like, you'll substitute red meat for a veggie patty that costs far less, but that just remains the same in the CPI, because it's not a tool to really understand prices. It hasn't been since 1970. It's a tool of propaganda. It's a marketing campaign for the Federal Reserve. And the truth is, if you're only eating Doritos, you don't notice the price of inflation. If you're only eating corn, you don't notice it. I mean, things seem pretty low. If you're ordering that ribeye, oh man, you're hurting. Like, you notice it.
Yeah, I love one thing that I've heard you say, that you can print Doritos like you can print fiat dollars. You can't do that with steaks.
You could do it at scale. Yeah. I mean, steaks. Luckily here in Arizona, I found a farmer that once a month I go and I get a huge haul. And so keep buying my book, people, because I need to afford these ribeyes. They're going up in price.
Maybe you can also touch upon, decentralized technologies are also somewhat censorship resistant. And I know that you've run into some amount of censorship or shadow banning, self-censorship. Even publishing books has become much, much more difficult, appearing on traditional mainstream media. Maybe you could offer a few words of optimism for the future, because there are systems that make that a little bit more difficult for the top-down evildoers.
Dude, I'm so excited. I'm so excited about what you're doing, Abel, like with your podcast and what other people are doing. So yeah, you mentioned that I used to be a respectable journalist before I went heretical. And I published with all the major publishing houses. When I wanted to write this book, I I didn't even bother. So the way it works is like you write a book proposal. I didn't send it to my agent. I was like, they will not take this book. Like, even though I have a good track record of selling books, nobody's going to take this book. I still fucking want to write this book. Like, I'm 46 now. Like, I don't give a fuck. Like, this is really important to me. I have 4 daughters. You think about your kids. It's like, we have legacies here. So one of the issues I was worried about was like, how am I going to get publicity? Because if nobody hears of this book, how am I going to? I am used to being on Fox News or CNN, and it's a really different medium because how it works is you fly in, you sit in a makeup chair for 20 minutes, you're in a green room eating bagels, and then you pop out and you have like 3.5 minutes. So the way it used to work was like you have, a message you want to get out. So you want to control the narrative in how you speak. And so I just have like things that I'd memorized, right? Like 4 things I'm going to say. No matter what they're asking, I have 4 things I'm going to say. You have no discussions. This world, I love this world of podcasting because first of all, you better fucking know what you're saying because we're going to talk for like an hour, right? Or like I just got off one, I did a podcast yesterday for like 2 hours and it's just like, holy shit. And it's like, I remember doing Newtown and you have 2.5 minutes and they all want to hear about, gun control. And I'm trying to explain mental illness and it's complicated. Nobody wants to, you can't 4 minutes, you can't explain like how all these shootings are linked to mental illness. And this is also like, I was thinking about when I first got on this podcast, I always speak like for 20 minutes straight because it's such a complicated issue and there's so many moving parts. I would never have had this opportunity pre 2015 because the podcast market wasn't there, but people like you and Safedine and I appeared on Dr. Sean Baker and a lot of these really insightful, thoughtful people. I think I'm going to be hoping to be on Tucker, in a few months, his platform, which is just really great, like really long form, thoughtful pieces that I listen to all the time now. And I'm kind of addicted to like your podcast and others that are just doing such great work in this field. But that change has been fantastic. I never would have been able to get this message out in the early 2000s. This book couldn't have been written because nobody would have published it. The Safe House, Safedine Moose, to his great credit, I reached out to him immediately after I read that chapter and told him who I was and what I wanted to do. And he was all on board, started a publishing house, and we're off.
That's amazing. And one other thing, maybe you could touch on quickly. You have clear range over the course of your career, which demonstrates to me that you have some amount of power over your own destiny to pursue the projects that interest you, whether it's with your family, working with Scholastic, crime, going after food. I'm excited to see whatever comes next, but we have a lot of people who are writers and creatives, authors out there. It's pretty easy to get painted into a corner. What words of advice would you offer to people to actually follow that work that appeals most to you or might be most important for you to do?
Oh man, that's a great question. I've been really blessed. I have a lot of passion and when I find something I believe in, I feel like I can do my best work. And I think about my kids a lot. I think about them reading this book, even though they fucking haven't read the book yet. For a while, it's like, right. But they will. And I know this sounds like a cliche. I hate saying it out loud, but just nobody's starving in America. Like you can still get red meat. You can still get like ground beef and you can get some things, right? Like just do what you're passionate about with your writing and a success will follow. I also have become a huge expert in failing. I've written many book proposals that went nowhere over time, but fortunately I wrote a screenplay. My first screenplay I wrote has been sold and that should be becoming a movie soon. That's in the works. It's on an internet pioneer. Before I fell into this rabbit hole, I wrote a book on Matt Drudge and the movie, they're currently looking for a director and in that process. And that's a lot of fun. It's my first into screenplay, but this is kind of taking me over now and I can't unsee it. I had an option to do a book and work with somebody that would have been a really good seller and would have been really great money. And I turned it down a few weeks ago after a lot of thought and talks with my wife, because this field is just so important to me. And I don't like my next book is going to deal with medicine. and I don't know what the market's going to be. Abel, like I don't know, but you live a life similar to me where like you follow your passion, and I don't know if anybody's going to buy it, and but I'm going to write this book, and it's going to be important, and that's going to be my North Star.
Right on. Right on. Well, Matthew, so much fun to talk to you. What is the best place for people to find Fiat Food as well as all of your other projects and works to come?
Thanks, man. Amazon. I have a show about my family on. I always feel weird. It's on it's on Apple TV Plus. I'm played by Jim Sturgis. He's like, it's awkward because he's such a better looking version of myself than I am, and people see me sometimes. You've seen the show. I can always see they're slightly disappointed. Well, it's Jim Sturgis, but the show's primarily about my daughter, kind of riding her coattails on that. And there's no date on the Drudge movie yet, but this is. I've never been more proud of a project than this book in my life, and I've written so much. This is a book I'm very, very proud of. It can be found on Amazon, anywhere books are sold, or Safieddine Moose has a publishing house, and he has some great books in there. And he has a deal where it's not only his work, which is amazing. Parker Lewis has a great book out called Gradually, Then Suddenly, which is like a primer on Bitcoin. It's really, really great. And also Lynn Alden has broken money on that. So you could get like a really good deal on all of the books. That's at safehouse.com. And that's my plug. I'm really bad at that stuff, but there's my plug.
I'll help. Everyone go out there and read Fiat Food. This is actually one of the most important books that I've read recently. I think it will make a lot of connections in people's minds between how exactly we got here in the food and health and fitness and medical area by linking that to finances. Whew, it's intense, but if you digest it for a bit and you think on it and look into it a bit more, it's real. It's a wacky story, but it's totally real. So people check out Fiat Food. And Matthew, once again, thanks so much for spending some time with us.
Thanks, Abel. Keep up the great work, man. And let's meet up again in Austin. I'd love to see you again.